Hey everybody, welcome to the last week of reading class, last week of school. Many of you joined us online for this lesson last week, Friday. And so I'm going to, for their sake, because we talked through this whole worksheet already and did it together, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over the vocab words and the questions. I'll do that quickly. And then we're going to talk about one topic today that goes with our book, and then we'll jump right into the reading for today. So it should be a quick fly through this first part. So, a lavatory. It said Grayson normally would get up and use the lavatory in the morning and then turn on the space heater, but the morning he died, right, he didn't do that, and that's how Maniac Magee knew something was wrong. So a lavatory is like a restroom, or maybe more commonly known as a bathroom, right? So it's just a fancy name for a bathroom. Pallbearers, again, going through this quickly. The pallbearers carried Grayson's coffin, right? And so that's people at a funeral. Coffin carriers, maybe would be one way to put it. Gotta use an IERS. There we go. People who carry the coffin at a funeral, the person who's died, the box that they're in, right? Those are called pallbearers. I actually just was a pallbearer. Often it's family members. My father-in-law passed away a couple months ago, as you know, and I got to help carry his casket to the hearse and then out to the cemetery. And so that's something I just got to do, but someone who carries the coffin of someone who passed away. 123 then, again, going real quick for those who were with us last week, because we don't spend a lot of time on this. It says, the only buildings here on 123 on the top were tiny log and mortar cabins, replicas of the Army's shelter. So this is where Maniac Magee went to hide out when he was just so depressed and just wanted to die, right? Replicas are copies or duplicates of something. So if you have a replica uniform, like a replica Kirk Cousins Minnesota Vikings uniform, it's a copy of his real uniform. Obviously, he didn't wear it, but it looks exactly like his. That's probably where you hear that word the most. So what did Maniac decide to do at the beginning of the chapter? Why? He ran away. He just couldn't stay in his bandshell closet home, right? Because it just was too sad not to have Grayson there anymore. What famous location did he go to? He went to Valley Forge. That's a place where the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War camped out for the winter when we were fighting against Great Britain to win our independence, right? And often armies wouldn't fight over the winter because they didn't have the technology to keep fighting through thick snow and things like that at that time, like jeeps and tanks like we have today. And so they just take a break for a few months. And that's where George Washington's army camped. And they were really beaten down and broken and cold and starving, and if you know some of the history behind that. And so what did Maniac decide to wait for there? He just wanted to die. He was so depressed and sad over Grayson's death. He just wanted to die himself. And now he's lost 4 different families, if you think about it, right? He's lost his original parents. He lived with his aunt and uncle, and that didn't work out. He lived with the Beals and loved it there, but too many people disliked him, so he had to run away. And now he's lived with Grayson, and Grayson's died. You can just imagine why Maniac is just like at the end of his rope. He's sick of it. Every time he thinks he has a family that'll take care of him, something goes wrong, right? You got to feel for him there. Who did Maniac find at the place where he stayed, and what were they doing? 2 boys named Russell and Piper, and they were running away, right? They said they were going to Mexico. Who did Maniac Magee say he was and why? He eventually said he was a pizza delivery guy because he wanted to try to lure them back to town, right, and keep them from running away by giving him one of his pizza prize pizzas that he got for undoing Cobble's knot, right? And then who did he run into? So he goes to Cobble's and gives these guys their free pizza, right? And he ran in. Who does he run into but good old John McNabb, the guy he hit the home run off of, right, and the frog off of, that baseball player that was kind of mean to him. And guess what? These 2 kids are his brothers. And that was kind of the shocking news about these 2 boys that were running away. So interesting little meetup there between Maniac Magee and John McNabb, someone who didn't like him in the past. We'll see if that changes, or if he thanks Maniac Magee for helping out his brothers. We'll see what happens. One of the things, though, I want to talk to you guys about for today, a topic that's going to become big in our book here, is the idea of poverty. That means poorness, living in very poor conditions, especially in the inner city. It just so happens that the inner cities of many of the big cities in our country are poorer areas often of our country and are difficult areas to live in. Because of overcrowding and because some of these big cities in our country are older and more run down in certain areas, it can be very, very difficult to live in some of the big cities of our nation. And we're going to see some of the characters in our book here. We have already seen a little bit, but some of the characters live in very poor parts of Two Mills, this town that Maniac Magee is in. And we're going to look at some of the challenges that can be caused by living in some of those areas and why that's a really difficult life. And I'm going to help you understand why some of the challenges that happen in some big cities are really there. So why do inner cities especially face these challenges of poverty and poorness and struggling to live? Here's one of the reasons. Inner city residents are often trapped in a culture of poverty. In other words, they're kind of stuck. It's hard for them to get out. Some of the reasons for that are there's just not many high-paying jobs. And so if you can't get a good job, it's hard to go and live somewhere that costs more money or that's a little more expensive and a little nicer. And so many of the people living in the inner cities are stuck in this culture of poverty. It's hard for them to get out. They can't get a good enough job to earn enough money to go live somewhere else. And the jobs there aren't very high paying, and there's a lot of competition for jobs because some of the inner cities are very crowded with people. And so that makes it difficult for people to get out of that culture of poverty or that circle of poverty. In some inner cities, there's things like drugs. When people are poor and they're running out of money to feed their families and to take care of their families, sometimes people get desperate and they turn to ways that are not good to make money because they can't find a good job. And so often that's drug use. And in many of the big cities in our nation, you find things like drugs. And sometimes people are selling drugs certainly because they're just sinful and they want to do something wrong. But often it's because they're so poor, they're desperate for money. And this is one way that they think they can earn money. And then that leads to often criminal activities. There's a lot more crime often in inner cities. And a lot of that is because gangs can form. And we've seen some gangs of kids, at least in our book, like the Cobras, right? Often gangs form in inner cities to control the drugs, right? So if there's certain people, if too many people sell drugs, then the drugs won't be worth as much money. And so what these gangs do is they gang up and they force everyone to buy drugs from them. And that causes violence often in inner cities, people fighting or gangs fighting over each other and the boundaries for where they can sell their drugs and things like that. That's some of the times some of the stuff that goes on in some of these inner cities. And often young people living in the inner cities get pulled into these gangs and influenced in bad ways, and that's not good. And we've seen that happen with some of the kids in our Maniac Magee book too. And notice this. This is something we've seen in our book. One of the things that often happens in inner cities is some of the areas get segregated. That means separated by ethnicity. Ethnicity is a fancy word for culture or skin color. For instance, African Americans or Hispanics are in one or two large continuous areas. And we see that in our book in 2 mills, right? There's definitely a white area of the city and a black area of the city. And often it is the black people who live in the inner cities. And here's why. Following the Civil War, when slaves were set free in the mid to late 1800s, many of them moved to some of the big cities to look for jobs. And in those big cities were often factories, jobs that didn't require a lot of schooling or training to work. And so many African Americans at that time moved to the big cities and lived right downtown by the factories where they could get jobs that didn't require a lot of education because as slaves they weren't able to do that. And so really for many generations, many of these African American families have lived in the inner cities. Whereas white people who were typically more wealthy because they hadn't been slaves and held down and things like that and had bad things done towards them, right, chose to live in the more expensive suburbs. And that's kind of how many of our big cities in our nation became segregated. And you have to feel for many of the African Americans who are trapped in some of these inner cities in poverty. We're going to look at one other reason why that's the case. Here's a big reason why many people in inner cities are trapped in poverty. How are schools run? Like, where did the public schools of St. Peter get their money to run their schools? From taxes, maybe you're saying to yourself, right? In the city of St. Peter, we pay a tax to the city. When you buy things or on your house and on your property, your parents pay a property tax. And some of those taxes go to not only pay for the policemen, the firemen and such, but also for the schools. But think about this. If people in the inner cities aren't making a lot of money, then are they going to be paying a lot of taxes? The answer is no. You always pay a portion of what you make. And since many people in the inner cities are already poor, they are not able to pay many taxes. And so the schools, like this inner city school here, don't have a lot of funding or money. And notice the conditions of some of the parking lots and just the school in general are kind of beat up. And you can imagine they probably don't have the best teachers or the best computers or the best books and textbooks and things like that, or equipment for learning. And so in many inner cities, the schools are very, very poor. which also gets them stuck in that cycle of poverty, right? Because if they don't have a good school to go to where they get to learn and have the ability to learn technology and good teachers to teach them, then when they graduate from school, if they didn't do very well, or they failed out of school, or they didn't do the learning they needed to, they're going to fall behind and not get into high school, or drop out of high school and then not get into a good college, and then they won't get a good paying job. Then they're stuck in low-end paying jobs, and then they're still stuck in the inner city. You can see that cycle of poverty, or circle of poverty, that's hard to get out of, right? If you don't have a good education, it can be very, very difficult to get a good job and then to get out of the poverty that you're in. And so we're going to see that. We're going to see some characters in our book living in extreme poverty in the inner city of Two Mills today. And I want you to have empathy for them. There are many people in our world that really don't have a good school to go to and really struggle, and to see that and not judge people if you see poor people living in a city and just think that they're lazy or something. That's often not the case at all. They'd love to get out of that cycle of poverty, but they just don't have the means or the schooling or the things that you have, and maybe even take for granted, to help them out with that. So I think this helps us, a book like this helps us to not take for granted the great school that we have to go to and the good education we're able to get, because many kids in our nation don't have access to that. Many of the kids in our nation are in overcrowded inner city schools like this one pictured here, where there's one teacher for, look at all these kids jammed into one room. Notice they don't have much technology, maybe a little bit. I don't know if this is a device or just something that's propped up on their desk, but can you imagine going to school in a place like that? And how much learning you would actually get done, and how much the teacher probably wouldn't be able to help you because there's so many other kids all jammed in a room, and you don't have real nice equipment. You've got blackboards instead of nice whiteboards or smart boards, right? And so you have to feel for many of the people living in our inner cities that they're just not able to get that good education, and it's a struggle to stay in school and to then get a good job, and then to hopefully get out of poverty can be very, very difficult. And so we're going to see that today, and I just wanted to share that with you to help you gain empathy, a feeling of care for people who, in our own nation, our own country, are in very difficult situations, run-down neighborhoods and run-down houses. We're going to see that in our book today. And then not only that, but run-down schools, and how difficult it is for those people to survive day to day, and the dangers sometimes of gangs and drugs and not having enough food or money to buy the things that you need. And so we're going to look at that struggle today a little bit in our book, but I want you to appreciate the things that you do have, because many people in our nation don't have some of the blessings of a safe place to live or a good school to go to that we're blessed with. And so certainly, hopefully, we want to reach out and help these people any way that we can. And maybe someday in your life, through a teaching at a school or through donations to different charities that you can give, you can help out people that are stuck in poverty. And so our code word for today is going to be that word. The code word you'll answer on your worksheet will be poverty, something that many, many people are trapped in, and that we'll see some characters in our book trapped in as well, too. And I hope that helps you gain an empathy and a care for people that are stuck in situations like that. So here we go. Let's read our next section. Watch for some of those themes and ideas of poverty that come up that we just talked about in this chapter, in this section. Here we go, 129 to 135. Follow along. It took a while for everything to get straightened out. First, Giant John, right, John McNabb, had to be convinced that Maniac was not kidnapping his brothers. Then the brothers had to do some more trembling and clinging while John finished lambasting them for running away, which apparently they did about every other week. Then when the brothers found out that their pizza person was none other than the famous Maniac Magee, the very same one who had blasted their big brother's fastball to smithereens and finished him off with a home run frog, well, it took a good 5 minutes of rolling on the sidewalk to get all the laughing out of their systems. You can imagine how John McNabb felt about that, right? Which, of course, got Giant John more than a little steamed, prompting Maniac, who didn't like seeing John disgraced before his little brothers, to say, "Yeah, but didn't John tell you what happened the next day?" Let's notice Maniac Magee, even for what might be considered his enemy, feels bad that John is getting laughed at by his younger brother. So look what he says. And the brothers said, "No, what?" And Giant John said, "Huh?" And Maniac winked at John and crossed his fingers. "Sure, John, you remember." Wink, wink. "At the Little League field the next day, you said I was lucky that all you threw me was fastballs because you weren't ready to reveal your secret pitch, the one you'd been working on, remember?" Wink. McNabb nodded dumbly. So he's kind of like, what is Maniac doing? And so I said, "Well, come on, I can hit anything. Pitch it to me." And you pitched it, and I missed it by a mile. And you kept pitching it to me all day long, and I never even hit a foul ball on it. "What was that pitch? What was that pitch?" chanted the urchins. "It was," Maniac paused for dramatic build-up, "the stop ball." "The stop ball?" Yeah, and you should have seen it. It comes right up to the plate, looking all fat and easy to belt, and then just when you take your swing, Maniac got into a batter's stance and demonstrated. It sort of stops, and your bat just whiffs the air. He whiffed at an imaginary stop ball. Wow, said the brothers, gazing up at their big brother. And so Maniac was invited to accompany the brothers McNabb to their home. So that's what I love about Maniac Magee. Notice how kind he is even to John McNabb, someone who's given him some trouble in the past. It's really cool, right? Bottom of 130. Despite the cold, the front door was wide open, and Maniac could smell the inside before he could see it. The first thing he did see was a yellow, short-haired mongrel looking innocently up at him while taking a leak in the middle of the living room floor. So that's a dog, obviously, right? So I want you to see that, remember, John McNabb and his family are white people. So we talked before we started reading today about poverty and inner city poverty especially, and one of the stereotypes is that it's just black people who live in the inner city and live in poverty, but that's a stereotype. That's not true. There are many white families, too, that struggle with that cycle of poverty. And here you go. Here's one example of John McNabb's family. Take a look at the way that they have to live because they're very poor. Clean that up, John ordered Russell. Clean that up, Russell ordered Piper. Piper just walked on by. After closing the front door, which was surprisingly heavy, Maniac found a stack of newspapers in a corner. He laid some over the puddle to soak in, then gave himself a tour of the downstairs. So notice Maniac is the one who ends up cleaning it up. Pretty cool. Maniac had seen some amazing things in his lifetime, but nothing was as amazing as that house. From the smell of it, he knew it wasn't the first time an animal had relieved itself on the rugless floor. In fact, in another corner, he spotted a form of relief that could not be soaked up by the newspapers. In other words, there's a dog poo in the corner even. Cans and bottles lay all over, along with crusts, peelings, cores, scraps, rinds, wrappers, everything you would normally find in a garbage can. And everywhere there were raisins. Now, do you think those are actually raisins? What looks a lot like raisins? Mouse poop, right? And so you can see just the poor and poverty and disgrace that this family lives in, right? You'll see why as we keep going. As he walked through the dining room, something, an old tennis ball, hit him on top of the head and bounced away. He looked up into the laughing faces of Russell and Piper. The hole in the ceiling from the first to the second floor was so big that they could both jump through it at once. He ran a hand along one wall. The peeling paint came off like cornflakes, so definitely poverty, a very poverty-filled house, right? Nothing could be worse than living in the dining room, yet the kitchen was. A jar of peanut butter had crashed to the floor. Someone had gotten a running start, top of 132, jumped to it, and skied a brown one-footed track to the stove. Skied a brown one-footed track to the stove. On the table where there appeared to be the remains of an autopsy performed upon a large bird, possibly a crow. The refrigerator contained two food groups, mustard and beer. The raisins were even more abundant. He spotted several of them moving. They weren't raisins, they were roaches, so probably not only just mouse poop, but even bugs, too, some of these raisins are. The front door opened, and seconds later a man clomped into the kitchen. He wore no winter jacket, only a sleeveless green sweatshirt, which ballooned over his enormous stomach. Tattoos blued his upper arms. His hands were nearly pure black. Stale body odor mingled with that of fries and burgers coming from the Burger King bag he held. Dropping the bag next to the bird remains, he bellowed, "Chow!" and took a beer from the fridge. He downed a good half of it in one swig, belched, double-clutched, and belched again. He had to know someone besides himself was standing in the kitchen, and just as obviously, he didn't care. So that's another thing about living in poverty is people who live in poverty often don't have the best diets. Because what's the cheapest food to buy if you don't have a lot of money? Things like fast food, right? Like $1 hamburger at McDonald's and French fries, right? The most expensive food tends to be the healthy stuff. Fruits and vegetables tend to be quite expensive, right? So many of these families living in poverty can't afford to eat healthy. And you can imagine how that affects their focus and their school life too. If you're not eating healthy, you can't focus and complete your schoolwork and have a lot of energy to get things like that done. And you can just see how these families are stuck in poverty, this white family even too, okay? Two floor quaking crashes came from the dining room. Geronimo! Geronimo! Russell and Piper had taken the direct route via the holes, and they jumped down from the upstairs through the hole in the ceiling. "What'd you bring, Dad? Whoppers?" "Yeah, Whoppers." They tore into the bag like jackals into a carrion. There's a nice simile, right? Plastic flew. Fries flew. They both wanted the same Whopper. Mashed between their tugging fists, the Whopper splurted sauce and cheese and pickle chips. Then it split. Russell lurched backward into the kitchen table with his half. Piper lurched backward into the opposite direction, and with nothing to stop him, sailed right through the cellar doorway and down the cellar steps. The final thud was followed by the truck horn blast of Piper's laughter. When Giant John ambled in, the father said, "Get the blocks?" "No," grunted John, pulling out a pair of whoppers. He tossed one to Maniac. "We need more," growled the father. John didn't answer. "We need more. I heard." McNabb smashed the tabletop. 3 fries and a bird wing jumped to the floor. "Now!" John walked out, nonchalantly munching. "I was busy." The rest of the night was scenes from a loony movie. Scene: McNabb, the father, swaggers bare-armed out the front door, bellowing back, "Do your homework!" Scene: Maniac retrieves the wet newspaper from the living room. There are no wastebaskets in the entire house. He finds a trash can in the backyard next to a pile of cinder blocks. He dumps the soggy papers in the can, which is empty. Scene: small turds of an unfamiliar shape appear here and there along the baseboards of the first floor. "Please don't be rats," Maniac prays. Obviously, it probably is rat poop, right? Scene: the Cobras, so the other friends of John McNabb, right, come. They glare at Maniac, but Giant John tells them to lay off. So notice, Giant John's attitude towards Maniac has changed, isn't it? Remember how we talked about when someone's unkind to you, God says to show them kindness anyways, and it'll heap coals on their head. Can you see that happening to John McNabb here? Right, Maniac was kind to him, even made up a story of how he couldn't hit a pitch that John McNabb was throwing because his brothers were laughing at him, right? You can see already John is treating him with more respect. It's a good lesson for us, right? They raid the fridge for beer, so these are kids way too young to drink, but notice what they're doing. They smoke cigarettes, they belch and fart, they curse. Russell and Piper, kitty cobras, pop their own beer cans, guzzle, swagger, belch, smoke, and curse. So notice the kind of life John McNabb and his family have. Obviously, there's no mom around, and this dad doesn't seem to care about them at all. Does that maybe explain to you a little bit of why John McNabb is the way that he is? You know, often when someone's a bit of a bully or mean, it's because that they have a very rough upbringing in a very rough house. And John McNabb, look at this filth and this non-caring dad that he lives with. It makes you feel sorry for him, right? It makes you understand why John McNabb maybe acts the way he does. And here they are, obviously with no parental supervision, doing some pretty bad things, right? Scene: football game from the front of the living, top of 124 room, into the back of the dining room. So they're playing football in the house. Except for space, it has everything a regular game has. Running, passing, blocking, tackling, kicking. There's little furniture to get in the way. Ordinarily, the windows wouldn't last 5 minutes, but the windows of this house are boarded up with plywood. Body-blocking cobra flies into the walls. The house flinches. Scene: a faint rustling noise behind the stove. Oh no, rats. Maniac dares to look. It's a turtle. Box turtle munching on an old Whopper lettuce. Phew. Scene: the boys' bedroom. Russell and Piper lie prone, like lie flat, at the hole. They fire toy submachine guns at the cobras heading out the front door. Piper jumps up and blows Maniac away, killing him in at least 15 times. "This is how we're gonna do it. Bam, bam, bam." "The guns'll be real," said Russell, still prone and firing, the stock of the toy gun right against his cheek. "Yeah," squawks Piper, "real." He flops back to the floor and sprays the hole downstairs. "Soon as they start coming in, bam, bam, bam." "Who?" said Maniac. "The enemy," said Russell. "Who's that?" said Maniac. Russell stops firing long enough to send Maniac a "Where have you been?" look. "Who do you think?" he sneers. He points the red barrel of the submachine gun toward the bedroom door, toward the east end, the heavy front door. Scene: darkness, silence. Sometime early in the morning, Maniac lies between the 2 brothers on the bed. Do cockroaches climb bedposts? Unable to sleep, asking himself, "What am I doing here?" Remembering Hester and Lester on his lap, Grayson's hug, corn muffin in the toaster oven, thinking, "Who's the orphan here anyway?" Hearing, as he at last lowers himself into sleep's dark, deep waters, a door slam, a slurred voice, "Do your homework!" Fearing, will I float? So notice Maniac realizes that, his life has been hard, but there might even be some kids out there who have a harder life than he does. Do you get what he's thinking about there? Boy, these McNabb kids have no parents who care about them, a dad who seems to be an alcoholic, drinking all this beer, getting into trouble. No one seems to be watching out for them. They're eating poor food. And Maniac starts to think, I've actually had it pretty good. I've had Grayson, the Beals, and my parents, even though they've died, and or some of those people are gone or he can't live with them, he's realizing, boy, his life maybe hasn't even been as hard as these kids right here. And then notice the racism, too. Did you hear who the McNabb kids were pretending to shoot? They were pointing towards the east end of town, towards the black end. And so you can see that they've been, taught by probably their parents to be very racist and hateful towards people of a different skin color. So we'll see if Maniac can have an impact on them, because that's not the way Maniac is. But Maniac decides to stay there. He can tell this is a family that can probably use his help. And you can see how he's already cleaning up around the house and everything. So we'll see how he affects this family that's in really, really rough shape. I think you'll enjoy reading and find very interesting this next part of the book. Have a good day, guys.